Before these recent developments in industrial hemp and medical marijuana, modern usage of the hemp plant is centred around just one of its many uses, its ability to alter consciousness. This is certainly not a recent phenomenon.
The oldest domesticated plants are the drug plants. We have historical evidence that they were domesticated by people before food crops. In various cultures throughout history, marijuana has been used, valued because it was a doorway to other states of consciousness.
Marijuana has been an important religious sacrament throughout Africa, the Middle East and Asia for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, the goddess Seshat, seen here with a hemp leaf above her head, was written about as the one who opens the door of heaven for you. In Hindu scriptures, the god Shiva is said to have brought cannabis from the Himalayas for human enjoyment and enlightenment.
शिव शिव जितना पीव उतना जीव जे न जाने गांजा गली वो लड़का से लड़की बम बम
It's a blessed plant. It's a blessed plant. That can give you a little happiness.
Why then is marijuana use so controversial in Western culture?
Marijuana cultivation and use in Europe probably was mainly as a fiber plant and food plant. And it's very possible that many people who grew it for fiber and for seeds did not know of its use as a psychoactive drug.
Terence McKenna is a leading researcher and author on the traditional uses of psychoactive plants.
The absence of a straightforward hallucinogen or psychedelic in the flora of Europe has given Western man a kind of particular horror of the kind of boundary-dissolving experiences that attend these plants. Another factor is the Christian church. The reliance of magical folk practitioners on plants was consistently suppressed by the church. So we have evolved our peculiarly alienated form of science and social polity completely in the absence of any connection back into the magical side of nature that Celtic and earlier peoples were very concerned to cultivate. So this, I think, is the source of our particularly destructive relationship to the earth and our particularly alienated state of social relationships among ourselves. Only 100 years has Western humanity and civilization actually grappled with the dilemmas which these substances pose. So we're at the beginning of making an adjustment which many traditional societies made a comfortable accommodation to millennia ago.
Our beginning to make an adjustment has been a rough one.
Our nation has zero tolerance for casual drug use.
When I was in England, I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it, and didn't inhale, and never tried it again.
I inhaled frequently. That was the point.
Virtually every leader gets asked this question sooner or later. George Bush admitted,
Yes, I've smoked pot. Yes, there you go.
Did you inhale? When did you stop?
I find that. Look, I seem to be. It seems to be quite unfair, Tony.
Oh.
If you do drugs, you will be caught. And when you're caught, you will be punished.
One of the major concerns is drug use among young people.
I think marijuana can make kids space out and lose their concentration, and I think the only remedy for that is good drug education, especially aimed at young people, about what are appropriate uses of it and what aren't. And I don't think it's a good idea to be stoned in school, for example. But we don't have any real drug education at the moment because in the present climate, that's impossible. You can't admit that illegal drugs have any positive uses. And all of the educational materials that are used in schools are designed to scare people away from that substance by exaggerating its dangers, and that doesn't work.
If you tell a 15-year-old that all these terrible things are going to happen to him or her when they smoke marijuana, and they've already tried it and they know that it didn't, Why should they listen to you when you tell them that crack cocaine might kill them? I wouldn't have if I was 15 and was misinformed like that.
I think that kind of education has a very negative effect. I think it enormously stimulates curiosity on the part of young people to try the forbidden substance.
The big media scare of recent years is that marijuana doubles the risk of schizophrenia. Recent studies have indicated that regular marijuana use, especially amongst young teenagers, can result in a higher chance of developing schizophrenia or a drug-induced psychosis. The studies have been criticised for not adequately determining what other recreational drugs were being used by the subjects and what kind of marijuana was being used. Since prohibition, marijuana growing has been forced indoors under artificial lights with chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and criminal growers whose only motivation is to make a quick fortune at the expense of others. While marijuana used to have 5 to 10% THC in balance with CBD and the other cannabinoids, modern breeding has exclusively favoured THC with levels getting close to 30%. This can produce very different effects than more traditional strains grown organically in a natural environment. Other recent studies have found no link between cannabis and schizophrenia. In spite of a fourfold increase in marijuana use in the last 30 years, there has been no corresponding increase in schizophrenia. Nevertheless, no one would disagree that adolescents, with their rapidly developing brains, should be discouraged from using all mind-altering drugs, especially if their experimentation is leading to paranoia and psychosis. The healthiest way to deal with this is through balanced drug education and counselling and support for those who have problems. Former George Bush Sr., in his address to the nation's school kids, had a more stern approach.
Now, I can imagine a few whispers out there. Maybe you think we'll never get drugs under control, that it's too easy for the dealers to get back on the street. Well, those days are over too. The revolving door just jammed. Some think there won't be room for them in jail. We'll make room. We're almost doubling prison space. Some think there aren't enough prosecutors. We'll hire them, with the largest increase in federal prosecutors in history.
America is now the country with the highest rate of incarceration. Approximately 20% of criminal convictions are marijuana-related.
There is no inherent psychopharmacological harmfulness of marijuana, which is anyway comparable to the harm of arresting more than 400,000 people, mostly young people, for marijuana transgressions every year in this country.
15 years later, in 2006, that number had doubled to over 800,000 marijuana arrests, with nearly 90% of these for simple possession. This comprised 44% of all drug arrests. Proportionally, it's a similar story in Australia, and arrests are increasing with zero-tolerance roadside drug testing. Unlike alcohol and other drugs, cannabis stays in the body long after any psychoactive effects.
Cannabis stays in the body because our body needs it. It holds on to it. It wants to use the wellness of that plant.
The tests also show positive for non-psychoactive CBD medical cannabis.
As a responsible member of society, I support any measure which identifies impaired drivers on the roads and removes them as a matter of public safety. However, the random application of chemical testing in no way correlates with the degree of impairment, and we much prefer, in place of random chemical testing, to use impairment-based testing as been done in the rest of the world. Bear in mind, Australia is the only country left that's doing saliva testing for cannabis detection, because it's simply been determined that it's not a contributor to road safety.
All this vigorous prosecution of marijuana, for example, has changed a situation where people grew their own, and usually rather mild marijuana, into a situation where marijuana traffic is dominated by organized crime. What we are doing in the war on drugs is exactly what the most successful drug kingpins like. We are, in a sense, using government money to keep the small-time opposition out of the business, to keep the prices up and to keep the supply coming from only the most protected sources.
Prohibition breeds corruption and breeds a black market. And we've seen in Australia quite a large number of police officers who have been charged in relation to the supplying of marijuana, and that's the corruption element that's inbred.
Lawrence McKinney holds a patent for extracting natural THC from cannabis plants for medical use.
The major advantages of the drug war to the Justice Department is that the RICO statutes allow them to confiscate and sell anything they can find that's connected to any person who has any large amounts of marijuana. And the result has been such amount of money, over $1 billion last year, that these drug laws are simply phenomenally profitable to the Justice Department.
Fighting a war on drugs is big business now.
It is strictly to encourage this society of people who can't imagine themselves in another job other than fighting a war. And when they run out of wars outside of the country, then we're implementing our own military on our own people, and it's just gotten totally out of hand.
Law enforcement, whether they are military or not, constantly try to take on more and more of the appearance of military, and it's a psychological tactic as much as anything else. When this happens to someone, the helicopters will come down and they'll hover and they'll direct troops, or there'll be troops traipsing in the woods near your house, and your animals will get frightened, and your babies will get frightened, and you'll get frightened, regardless of whether you're involved in anything illegal.
When the walls have begun to crumble, when the laws have begun to burn, when the wind is singing freedom, when the stone begins to turn, when the wind is singing freedom, 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 freedom.
You have vast amounts of money internationally spent to force other countries to go after their marijuana. Nepal was one of the last countries in the world that had a controlled marijuana marketplace, you might say, that was well controlled by the government. Now, because of the pressure from the United States, they made it illegal. With marijuana suddenly illegal, the trafficking was taken over by criminals. And these criminal smugglers very rapidly began to discover there were things that were more valuable than marijuana to smuggle, and infected Nepal and that whole area with heroin smuggling and worse.
The repression of Lebanon's ancient hemp industry occurred during the First Gulf War at the behest of the US government and Syria's President Assad.
The United States drug policy in toto affects every country.
Eddie Engelsman is head of drug policy for the Dutch government.
We think that cannabis use is hazardous. We have a very, I must say, comprehensive anti-smoking policy. But does this harm or this risk of getting any harm justify such draconic measures? We think no. At least our policy shouldn't do more harm than such a drug would do.
Every major government study ever publicly funded that studied hemp has come to the conclusion that criminalizing it is a bad methodology.
Since 1970, there have been up to 12 inquiries or royal commissions or parliamentary inquiries into the drug marijuana, and all of those inquiries have recommended decriminalisation, yet no government has been prepared to stand up and say, well, the inquiries have recommended decriminalisation, we will act on the recommendations of the inquiries. All the surveys show that over 50% of the community accept the use of marijuana, and if that is so, then what you're doing is getting a law that is enforcing something that the community doesn't necessarily want enforced.
In Holland, the drug problem, the issue, is considered an issue of health and welfare. So it's not for the police and the courts. One objective of our cannabis policy, if I may say so, not prosecute people. It is illegal, but to a certain extent tolerated, which has nothing to do with a laissez-faire approach, but we didn't want to push people underground.
The sale of marijuana is tolerated in many Dutch coffee shops.
Nowadays, cannabis users have nothing to do with users using harder drugs. We have integrated education on cannabis in our general health education system in schools. In America, cannabis use is many times higher than it is in Holland. In spite of all the measures and all their wars and all their warning and just say no campaigns.
Dutch common sense is slowly catching on. After almost a century of cannabis prohibition, the early 21st century saw the green steadily spreading and the red retreating. In 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first states to legalize cannabis, followed by Alaska, Oregon, and Washington, D.C. in 2014, and the nation of Uruguay in 2015. By 2016, the light green areas had decriminalized, and the turquoise areas had mostly stopped enforcing laws against personal use. So what is the attraction to marijuana?
It does carry a fantasy-inducing, thought-catalyzing quality. It allows the mind to rove and scan in a much more expansive domain of information than is normally the case. I mean, if you don't smoke cannabis, you may spend your evening balancing your check account. If you do smoke cannabis, you may spend your evening contemplating the causes of the Greek Renaissance.
It's a perceptual enhancer. It's like a child seeing something for the first time. There's a little bit of that excitement about the visual world. It enhances the appreciation of music and the graphic arts.
I have met many people who I think have experienced increase in imagination and creativity from experimenting with marijuana, who have discovered themselves as physical, sensual, sexual beings on marijuana who otherwise had not developed that part of themselves.
They find that it's useful in gaining perspective and insight in their lives.
Marijuana creates a receptive, suggestible state which could facilitate certain kinds of therapy. It often increases people's access to their own unconscious, to the images that they have in their mind, to their dreams, to feelings which they might not be aware of. So I think it could be in the right hands an aid to therapy.
Not everybody is capable of using cannabis in this way, but it can be used in this way by people who make an effort to learn to use it in this way.
Obviously, Western society fails to offer guidance on how to use marijuana beneficially.
I've seen many people who use marijuana addictively, many people who use it all the time, and I think get very little effect out of it. I see people who smoke it and get groggy and doped out.
The real problem is that people do too much. They don't understand that the best way to do cannabis is approximately once a week.
The desire to have altered states of consciousness is basically healthy and normal. It can have bad expressions, and I think in our culture where there's no recognition of that desire and we don't teach young people how to satisfy it in healthy ways, it's obvious that we're going to see a lot of negative expressions of it.
More money has been spent trying to find something wrong with cannabis than any other vegetable material in human history. And what they've come up with is so pathetically thin that I am confident that it amounts to a clean bill of health for this stuff.
US government health authorities estimated in 2015 that there were about 480,000 deaths caused by tobacco and around 88,000 from alcohol. This did not include alcohol's involvement in 10,000 road fatalities and 65% of all murders. There were 26,000 deaths from legal opioid and benzodiazepine medicines, and 1,000 deaths were recorded as overdoses of aspirin. There were 10,000 deaths from heroin, 5,000 from cocaine, and 2,000 from all other illegal drugs, while ailments relating to caffeine may have killed up to 10,000 people. But there have been no deaths attributed to marijuana.
Cannabis is not a health problem. The problem is that it promotes social values and attitudes which are unwelcome in capitalist market-based society. It's just that simple. A drug like coffee, with a horrendous health profile compared to cannabis, is completely welcomed into the marketplace and the home and the lifestyle of modern people. This is simply that we value certain states of mind and we fear and suspect others. And this is based entirely on value systems that are inculcated from above.